So last week we handled the death, this week we're handling the rebirth. And real talk, folks, this is one of the first real stories that I really delved into. So let's get into it.
And it's Thursday. You know what that means? It's time for us to have another Throwback Thursday. And we're gonna go back in time, throw up that celebration, because Heart of the Stories we tell, and me, Rob the host, is going to take us back to a quick nostalgic look and see how a story was that might be a little bit on the older side. So celebrate your week almost being over as we look at
The Return of Superman. And last week I said I wouldn't rate the death of Superman, even though I wanted to give it a mithril, because I wasn't really an unbiased observer. My nostalgia glasses were high. But I think I can fairly safely say this is a gold-rated story. Close to a platinum, but not quite there. It definitely has lots of tricks and all sorts of things you're going to love. It's not the first comic I read. That would be G.I. Joe. It was not exactly my first DC comic either. I was reading Batman and Superman as these stories started, but it was the first one that I really dived into. And these four characters amazed me. Now, back then, I didn't know what I know now about plotting and the way stories work and all the tropes, so I really thought this guy had killed Superman for good, and those four were all we were getting. But alright, for those of you that don't know what I do here, I try to review stories as they come out, movies, books, comics, you name it, TV shows, and then I do Throwback Thursdays like this and theory videos on Sundays. Not this Sunday because of Easter. But if that sounds interesting, click subscribe and join our little community. Because this man right here, Dan Jurgens, I did a whole video just on his career, is one of the amazing people who killed Superman multiple times, and is also responsible for this.
So once again, it's stop. Spoiler time. Ba-dun-dun-dun.
So let's talk about the setting for a second. The setting is the post-crisis, pre-New 52 DC universe. It's obviously the same continued story from the death of Superman and Funeral for a Friend, and it is the basic world that most of us knew as DC comic book readers throughout all of the 90s, part of the 80s, and all the way up through the 2000s. It's one where this guy killed Superman. As for characters, I'm actually going to say the most important character in this story is Lois Lane, which is funny because she's not in it that much. She gets pushed to the side regularly until the end, and in the end that's very important why she isn't. But these are the four that are the main protagonists. We have the cyborg Superman, who looks, if you look closely, like he's the person who was rebuilt with Kryptonian technology after that horrible fight with Doomsday. The last son of Krypton, and the person who I thought was the actual Superman returned, just with a darker edge. Although all the clues I found were based entirely on the fact that I had figured out who he actually was, and just thought that was clues to it being Superman. Long story. John Henry Irons, the man called Steel. And you know what? Steel is pretty much Iron Man, if he were a big black guy trying to replace Superman. And he was very cool. In fact, he might be in my top 10 characters of all time, so give him props. Then we have the Metropolis Kid. Don't call him Superboy, he's Superman. Although, I'll be honest, he, at the end of the story, becomes Superboy, finally. And he's probably the character that at the time I followed the most. His comic I read all the way through, and his interaction with Supergirl was interesting. We also had other characters. We had Mongol, we had Green Lantern, we had a bunch of others, but I think we hit the main thrust here. So let's get down to the plot. And the plot is linear, and it picks up right where we left off last time. Superman has died, and everyone in the world is in shock. They've buried him, but wait a minute, there's something the matter. His body is missing. And at the same time his body is missing, four other people show up claiming to be him. Well, three and a half. Yeah, three and a half, really. Because we have the clone, we have the Cyborg remake, we have the reborn last son of Krypton, and we have the man called Steel, who, again, isn't actually claiming to be Superman per se. He's just filling in for Superman, so that's kind of cool. And in this world, that's what we've got. But that's not where the story really starts. That's where we come in. Because you see, there's this white bag Superman that starts it all. And it tells the story of Pa Kent having a heart attack and seeing his son, Clark, being attacked by demons. And he helps him. And when he comes back, instead of going towards the light, he brings Superman's soul with him. And instantly, that's when we find the body missing. And that's when, hey, wait a minute. Could his spirit be back in some or all four of these people? And that's a pretty good theory, I'll be honest. My original thought was that he was the Eradicator, or maybe he was some amalgam thereof. And I always thought there was something wrong with the cyborg Superman. The parts didn't exactly lean exactly in the right places. And of course, like I said, Superboy was a clone, so I doubted he had the soul. But I did keep thinking maybe the man called Steel had the soul of the Man of Steel in him. But you see, we find out that the last son of Krypton is actually the Eradicator, and that's kind of funny because I used all the evidence back then of the Eradicator to say, see, he's just embracing his Kryptonian heritage. And the cyborg Superman is really a villain called Hank Henshaw. Now, Dan Jurgens did not invent either of these characters, but he used them through excruciatingly good detail to cash in on a history that Superman had that was pretty brilliant. Of course, Superboy was just a clone, Steel, and not even a true clone either. They couldn't clone Superman. So what they did was they cloned a human being, and then they built psychoactive, telepathic, telekinetic powers into him that could duplicate Superman's abilities. And then later they retconned that into they used partial Kryptonian DNA and partial human so that Lex and Superman were both Superboy's father. But the big final reveal, yeah, super spoilers for a series that was from when I was a kid. Superman's body was stolen by Eradicator and was being used as an energy battery. Somehow, where between the soul saving that Pa Kent did and using him as a power battery that Eradicator did, he came back to life, but with no powers. And then he got his powers back when Eradicator sacrificed himself. But all of this also goes into a whole Green Lantern story where his hometown was destroyed by evil Cyborg and Mongol, but we're not going to talk about that entirely right now. And long before I ever heard of a game of Song of Fire and Ice, this was a switching point of view. Each of the four main comic books had one of the main characters as their primary point of view. They even went so far as to hide things like the fact that Hank Henshaw was the bad guy by having him do heroic things. All these years later, I remember Adventure of Superman was Superboy's, Action Comics was Cyborg, Man of Steel, and Superman were Steel and Eradicator. But what were the themes and symbolism? Much like the death of Superman, we have a lot of feelings of loss here. We get them intermixed with how people come to terms without someone and what happens when their whole life gets turned upside down. The love story between Lois and Clark is put first and foremost through a lot of these. In fact, there's a panel I love that she flew into his arms faster than a speeding bullet. And of course, the introduction of new characters that to this day are a part of the Superman mythos, including all the way up through Doomsday, just plain and simple. But what about the bad? Let me just start right off the bat with unfair mystery! Having your narrator from an issue be a bad guy and not narrate it is BS. Secondly, as much as I love these characters, there's part of me that thinks that there's a certain amount of, sensationalism the death of Superman caused to bring them. And remember how I said that I really loved some of those scenes with Lois? I think she was dangerously underused here. And then that brings us to the good, the bad, and of course, the ugly. And you know what? Other than a handful of artist missteps, I don't have anything. This was such an awesome story. Like I said before, it's one of the first ones I really got into. It definitely made my day, and as I was growing up, I think it made me part of the writer and critic that I am today. And even though if this same exact story happened today, I'd be like, no, of course they're not permanently killing off Superman. Back then I didn't believe that. I really thought that he was gone. And of course, they're not replacing him with 4 other people. But back then, I thought they could. Maybe it's that nostalgia, that bit of innocence, that I didn't know how stories worked. But either way, let me know, what did you think of the death and the return of Superman? And don't forget to also let me know what you think about 80s month, because that's what next month's going to be. But for now, if you liked and enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up, and of course share this video. And if you haven't already, click that subscribe button, because we are going into how and why we tell stories, and with an entire month of throwbacks to the 80s, I think we're going to have a lot of fun. And if that sounds interesting and you want to get your 2 cents added in, leave a comment, join our community, and I'd be more than happy to spotlight something that you have to say. But for now, I'm actually going to watch the second episode of Krypton, because this is Superman, and I love Superman. Have a good night, and thank you for walking with me through the heart of the stories we tell.